Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Biblical Rogues Gallery. I'm Jonathan Pritchett, and along with me tonight is the renowned Dr. Derek P.G. Beeler. How you doing, Derek?
Doing well. Don't forget that doctor. It means a lot to me.
I know. Well, I mean, you were crowned renowned doctor by the James White.
Yeah, I earned it.
I
worked hard for that. He crowned me that while I'm blocked.
Oh, nice.
And so I made it through that wall to get this. So,
yeah, it seems like a lot of his fans have crowned you heretic and Pelagian and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
I don't know why you get so much flack and I don't. I mean, they are all over you. They just they leave me alone.
I think I just acquired more hate follows than you. So anything I say.
It's sad. I need to be more anti-Calvinist, I think. I'm kidding. Anyway, tonight we have a small group of rogues, two. Almost not even qualify as a gallery, but we'll make do tonight. Last week we got into a bunch of arguments over nothing. Seemed like we had the conversation about penal substitutionary atonement, and we had Nick whining, and we had Will whining even more, and then we had you and I and Braxton all were like, yeah, we still affirm it. Of course, they think that my version is weak and soft anyway, so what can you do? But they're not here tonight. So and Nick's watching as he's commenting as he's supposed to be doing sermon prep and some other things tonight that he couldn't make it, but here he is watching, saying he was right. You weren't right. You were like, Helistarian always refers to it it's a place, as if that matters. As if the meaning and significance of the place didn't have anything to do with it. And I remember Will was like, it's all about purity and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, it is. And to an ancient Near Eastern Israelite, you do the purity rituals. You know why? To expel pollution, because what happens when you don't? You incur wrath.
Well, and maybe we can just conclude that, you guys went back and forth last week, and now neither of those two are here. So,
right.
Licking their wounds.
Yeah. But, my version, you can go back and listen to last week. I'm not going to recap everything that I believe about it, but my version is not the traditional Reformed version of penal substitutionary atonement anyway. So I have a version that if I think Nick agrees with it, he just doesn't think that it's in that verses 21 through 26 of Romans 3. But Will, I think he can live with my version if he had to affirm it, but he doesn't have to affirm it. So he's got a book, and once you have a book on an issue, you can't change your mind after you publish, right? That's the rules. They're dumb rules, but that's very, very, very few people actually go back once they're in print. But some do. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, that's why gosh, I'm me, so of course I'm going to take this shot. But what was it, like 24 years ago, James White wrote The Potter's Freedom, and that's a really, really terrible book, but he's got to stand by it. So
yeah,
even though he's kind of modified a little bit of how he nuances things since then.
Well, speaking of Dr. White, we assign his book. Leighton Flowers assigns The Potter's Freedom in a course that he teaches. It's an elective course on Romans 9 here at Trinity College, the Bible Theological Seminary. And he assigns Dr. White's book, and he assigns his own book. So he gives them both in this special topics course that he teaches. So, and it gets quite a few students every year. So, James White ought to take me out to lunch for McDonald's for the royalties we say.
That's right.
And he gets from me us assigning it to students. He doesn't have to take Leighton Flowers though.
We won't force that on him.
Right. But he could take me out because, I'll just say this is not true, but I'll just tell him I told him to do it. but actually, I didn't. He designed. I don't tell professors what books to assign. I make suggestions, but I don't tell our professors what to do. Be on time for things.
Like, I don't tell them what to do. I just strongly urge it.
Right. If you want your paycheck, things like that. Because I can go spend it all on more fitness equipment, I guess. I don't know.
There you go.
Anyway, let's get into tonight's verses. 27 through 31. I will read it. You've already read, haven't you?
Yeah, I read a couple weeks ago.
I haven't read in a while, so I'll go ahead and read it. Where then is boasting? It has been excluded. By what kind of law? Of works? No, but by a law of faith. For we maintain that a person is justified by faith apart from works of the law. Or is God the God of Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles also? Yes, of Gentiles also. Since indeed God, who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith, is one. Do we then nullify the law through faith? Far from it. On the contrary, we establish the law. Now, I like this passage, and we had a lot to talk about in one of the longest shows we've done so far last week. So hopefully we'll keep this one mercifully short to make up for it. So we'll see how that one goes. But I do like these verses because there's actually a lot here, and we leave it to the people who aren't showing up to make the PowerPoint, Nick, but I edited the PowerPoint because he put a bunch of stuff that he wanted to talk about that he's not here to talk about, and I didn't care about. So that's how that goes.
Like, where's the apocalyptic in this passage? I'm sure it's there.
Yeah, it's in every passage. It's, he's like, apocalyptic is his response to everything as a male in his mid-30s, whereas like kids in Sunday school class, Jesus is the answer to everything.
I get what you mean.
This is his. I mean, you ask any question in Sunday school, they answer Jesus. I mean, you could be talking about the book of Judges, and they're just like Jesus. My wife and I used to do children's church together sometimes, and that's, you ask a question, and it's Jesus is the answer to everything. It's fun.
Well, and I led junior high youth boys for a while, and you ask a question, they're going to default to that, and sometimes they're right, and you're just like, well, I mean, you're right, but I only by accident. Like, let's talk about this more.
Right. Well, no matter where you are, it's like, well, Jesus himself said, it's a little trick that the whole, they were writing about me in the Old Testament. So, that, I guess. So, I mean, it's not wrong in one way. So, but this passage, what I like about it is some of the debates about that first sentence, where then is boasting? So that question about boasting, a lot of people have taken it to mean you can't boast, right? And if you run to Ephesians, not by works so anyone can boast. This idea of boasting, a lot of people think that it's the proud, proto-Pelagian do-gooder who champions, all the wonderful things that he's done and boasts in his own, self-effort.
Right.
But I don't really see that in this passage.
I can't say I did either.
I think the boasting here is not in one's own, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and show off how wonderful your good works are. But if you look at it, boasting is excluded by what kind of law of works? No, but by a law of faith. We maintain that a person, just anyone, is justified by faith apart from works of the law. And then the next statement is, or is God the God of Jews only? And so this would be, I think, boasting in a national sense.
Yeah.
Right? Those who call themselves Jews, right? I mean, just the flow of the passage since chapter 2, where Paul turned his guns back on Israel. So, but it could be in a sense. Nick used the phrase identitarian boasting because he didn't want to. He didn't. Well, he did that. He said identitarian because the new perspective would say like national or ethnic boasting,
Yeah.
and that may not sit well with, to quote the critical drinker, modern audiences. But yeah, I mean, not necessarily national, I guess. But then again, when you have a situation like Paul's dealing with in Rome, and you have a divided church, probably along those lines of national or ethnic split between Jews and Gentiles, you would think that some of the boasting there, if you're starting off a chapter, a discourse, what advantage do you have, and then you get to this section where he's talking about boasting. It seems like it's boasting in, position that historically Israel was in as the elect people of God.
Mhm.
So I think that a lot of the Reformation debates have shaped the way we think about these kind of passages.
Oh yeah.
And so sometimes we need to
Modern scholars.
Yeah. We need to make that a thing. But yeah, so that's one of the things that kind of a thing there that we can adjust a little bit.
Well, I was just gonna say, because we're talking about that, and like what is meant by works and stuff, and shaped by like Reformation era ideas of works and stuff like that. And I'm like, but I mean, everything pretty much leading up to the end of this chapter, we get a lot of Jew versus Gentile distinctions, or what does this one have that this one doesn't? But we find out that they're both consigned under sin. And so then to move here, it's like, oh, they're talking about boasting as in meriting something through just works in general. I'm like, I don't really see that. What I do see when I look at that as Jews boasting, and I'll avoid using the word privilege, but what they had the law, the covenant, they were the elect ones, but Paul has already established they're also under sin, just like the Gentiles, so they don't have a right to boast just because of that whenever it comes to justification.
Right. So, I mean, it seems like he's still on this same track, right? I mean, he hasn't left it. But the Reformation debates, we've seen the trajectory from that, boasting about your own good works. And it went from, that's what they assumed Paul was saying to the Jews, to that's what we're saying Paul's saying. It applies to Catholics, right? And they didn't stop there. Now it's Arminians pat themselves on the back for their own free will decisions to have faith, which is, not all Calvinists would, think that faith is a work, so to speak. But, you kind of get those same polemics. And, a lot of people, when they preach Romans, and we're not to that part where we talk about how to preach it, but a lot of people, when they do preach this, they want to stress that, your good works can't save you. You're justified by faith apart from works of the law. Well, what does Paul even mean by works? And does anyone who is not a Christian outside of in the 90s, I remember, well, if you're a good person, you go to heaven, right? I don't even hear that anymore. I hear, I don't know, it's mostly agnosticism, or about whether or not there's an afterlife. So,
or apathy.
Yeah, or apathy, right? So the interesting thing is, I don't know how much it actually lands if you're stuck in the Reformation thinking about all of this kind of stuff. How much it lands to preach to somebody's like, your good works can't save you. And they would probably try to tell you that I'm not trying to be saved by my good works, right? I don't care. So that whole line of thinking, we'll have to talk about that when we get to the what should you preach or what shouldn't you preach.
Mhm.
But Nick's chiming in. Nick, if you're gonna just watch this instead of do your work, just log on and then join the conversation.
I wonder if he's commenting while he's driving, because that would be dangerous.
No, because the spelling's correct. So
Yeah.
he would be using either the voice thing or whatever, speech to text or whatever. But yeah, so I don't know what this lands, but there's a lot of debates around what works is.
Mm-hmm.
And the old perspective was you could say it was either following the law, or you could branch that out to anything good that you do, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what works of the law, what Paul meant by works or works of the law. Even going back to Jerome, so this wasn't new to the new perspective, but even Jerome was saying that he had thought that these were, and the new perspective kind of picked this up too, or the new perspectives, to make Nick happy, that works were primarily had to do with kosher, circumcision, and Sabbath, like the identity markers, so to speak. That's the language that they would use, or the badges,
right?
N.T. Wright's language, like that were distinctly and outwardly Jewish, that you could identify them as Jewish, just by those primary observances that were, badges, so to speak. And so that wasn't anything new or radical. I mean, that, even Jerome was arguing that. So, how do you shake all that out? What do you think Paul means by works here?
Well, the first thing I want to say is, because I've encountered it online enough that I kind of feel like I have to say this whenever people, like, because he's talking here, where then is boasting? So the first thing I would say is that we don't get to boast in our faith as much as that is accused, like, all the time. So it's like you get into these discussions about works and, earning your salvation. You talk about, you're saved by faith, and they'll throw out so you chose to be saved, your faith, you're boasting that you had faith and this person didn't, therefore you're boasting in your salvation. And I think a passage like this makes it really clear that you can't make that argument using Paul's theology about faith, because he says, where then is boasting? It has been excluded by the law of faith, and we are justified by faith apart from the works of the law. So and especially if you take it in the ancient context, I think Barclay did a really good job showing this in his book, that grace, we talk about patron-client reciprocity and gift-giving benefaction. And what he argues pretty well, I think, is that whenever it comes to the grace of God, it's not just that we didn't earn it, but we actually deserve the exact opposite of what the grace affords us. And so whenever we come before God in faith, we are not boasting about that, because it is literally us coming to our knees saying, we can't do this. We are insufficient. We are unable. We need the help of God. That's what we're putting our faith in. So you don't boast in your faith, for one. So, some people argue faith is a work. You believe it or not, but some will say it's kind of like works if it's your faith and you conjured it up and stuff like that. But I feel like I needed to address that first off. But your question was about, like, works, as far as like works of the law and works in general. And I think sometimes I'm willing to say that it's just works in general that can be in view. I think in contexts like this, and a lot of what we've already covered in Romans is specifically works of the law. But I think what doesn't get emphasized enough is sometimes when we're talking about works, we need to also establish that there's a difference between works and merit. So even if you're saying, like, you did this thing, right, and somebody would want to be like, oh, that's a work, and you're like, well, call it whatever you want, it didn't merit this, so I do see a distinction there. But I don't know, I feel like I kind of paraded around your question. Hopefully I answered it.
Well, I take it to mean just I don't take it to be, I think in this context, it's specifically the Mosaic law. So I don't take it to just be the identity markers. I think it's broader than that. But I don't think that Paul just means, the pagan who still will help a little old lady not get run over by horses or something. It's right. I mean, he's not. He's. I think that's too general, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's too narrow to say. He even if Paul had in mind, circumcision. We know he's been thinking about that in particular here, and he had in mind those kind of identity markers. I think that because he is juxtaposing, law of works versus law of faith,
Mm-hmm.
right? So he has no problem shoehorning the word law there next to faith too, right? So it's so because he's doing that, I am sympathetic to the idea that there is some sort of boundary markers in mind, because he's trying to redraw those boundaries and saying, well, it's the Jew plus Gentile team faith as opposed to, team Torah or
Right.
specifically team works of Torah,
Mm-hmm.
right? So those are two different groups. And this, of course, what Paul does, the kind of fun that Paul has with, the law here, and, which talks about the law of faith, talks about upholding the law by faith instead of, nullifying it or demolishing it or whatever. It seems like there's what Paul does with law, James likes to do with works.
Right.
and it causes a whole lot of confusion between what James is saying and what Paul's is saying. So if anyone is interested, Trinity Radio has another YouTube channel called Trinity Radio Extra. And I'm not going to rehash a very long video over there where I go through James chapter 2 and then show how that reconciles with Paul. But I encourage you to watch that, because I don't think that these two are in conflict, but I don't resolve it the way people normally do. I throw out the idea of same vocabulary, different dictionary. I throw out the justified before men rather than God. I mean, James starts off by saying, can that faith save? Also, I throw out he doesn't mean like eternal salvation save, just means something else.
Right.
I'm like, no, but I want to get those views up over on Trinity Radio Extra, so I'm not going to give away the store.
Right. Well, and I mean, I've always heard, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Martin Luther kind of had he questioned whether or not James should even be in the Bible at all.
Yeah, he wanted to pitch it in the furnace.
Right. And so I think that just kind of attests to what you were saying about some of the flaws of the Reformation era idea of like how they parse out works in contexts like these. Like, because when you do it wrong, you have a wrong starting point. It seems like James is going to come in and be like, wow, this is the exact opposite of what Paul says. That can't be, that can't be true. Right. Something like that.
Well, well, let's go to Amber's question. Couldn't works be those things that place us in some sort of transactional relationship with God? I did such and such, and now God such and such. Kind of, but if you flip that around, going back to what Derek was saying earlier about Barclay, and I guess this kind of ties into what you were just saying. There was, a covenantal relationship between Israel and Yahweh, but there's also a covenantal relationship between the new covenant, a better covenant. It's not of works, but if you understand grace in its ancient Mediterranean context, our works that we do, they're not transactional. They're done out of thanksgiving or gratitude.
Or reciprocal.
Yeah, they're reciprocal. So that's that reciprocity, because Seneca talks about what Derek was saying about far from meriting, we're not just the undeserving, but we're the ill-deserving, because we have, and Seneca talks about, well, the highest honor for a patron is to give as the gods do, and not just to give to the undeserving, but to those who ill deserve it, who deserve the exact opposite. And so in that context, people, if Yahweh is understood as giving to the ill deserving who deserve the exact opposite of what God is offering through Christ, that affords him the highest honor. So in response to having received that grace, you show your gratitude through loyalty and through good works. And so when Christians try to parrot Isaiah and say things like, well, our good works are nothing but filthy rags, and I'm like, well, hang on. A, a, a a rebellious Israel's good works are like filthy rags.
Yeah.
You were created in Christ Jesus for good works so that you could walk in them. So don't be calling the works God gave us to walk in as new creatures in Christ filthy rags. It's kind of insulting to Jesus, right?
Yeah.
So in your piety flex, you've kind of actually dishonored Jesus by saying the good works that we were created in Christ Jesus to walk in are filthy rags. So Christians shouldn't run around saying, now, in modern discussions, you'll hear, well, the good works on my own. Yeah. And I say, well, if you're a Christian, you have the Holy Spirit. So, you're not really on your own. And any good you do is because of the Holy Spirit. So it's still that, it's only when you think you're doing good, but it's in direct violation of God's commandments is when it's not good. Those are filthy. Yeah. That's what you did on your own, right? With your sin. But so I always kind of roll my eyes when the worm theology wants to creep back in, that you end up trying to sound so pious and humble that you end up, being disrespectful because if you did something good, you did it because of the Holy Spirit,
Yeah, and it's the same discussion whenever they reference Jeremiah 17:9 about the heart being desperately wicked. And it's like, well, yeah, but did we not get a new heart? Does Christ not dwell in our hearts through faith? Are we not sanctifying this heart? So, there's a context and more to consider there as well.
Right.
Because come up against that a lot.
Yeah. So it's Amber, it's not really, we're not in a transactional relationship. We're in a Thanksgiving gratitude relationship, a reciprocal relationship, because God has done good for us when we didn't even deserve it. We are going to express that through loyalty and the good works that He has created for us to go do. So that's kind of how that works. So in this passage, what Paul's really getting at is that the way I say it like this, and this might help people for the whole Paul James thing. So what Paul is dealing with here is team faith versus team works of Torah, right? And he's saying team faith, those are the justified ones. Team Torah, you can't be justified because you're trying to be justified by Torah.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the righteousness from God that was revealed in Christ Jesus. That's you trying to establish your own righteousness, right? So the whole point here is the eschatological people of God are the team faith, not team works of the law. Now, what is James talking about then? Well, James is writing to the churches, and he's talking about, it's kind of a shirts and skins thing.
Yeah.
He's talking to team faith, and then you have squad faith alone and squad faith and works, right? So that's an in-house thing. Paul is talking about in-groups and out-groups, and James is talking about two different squads within the in-group.
Mm-hmm.
And so when he says, don't you know that you're justified by works and not by faith alone? When James is saying that, he's operating he's talking to a squad that thinks faith alone is devoid of any works whatsoever. Paul wouldn't have a problem with that. And I go into this more in that other video. Paul wouldn't have a problem with James saying that to squad faith alone because their working definition of faith is deficient.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't really care if you want to say, well, because true faith leads to works, or however you want to shake that out, that's fine. But, James has no problem saying justified by works because he understands a proper understanding of faith, whereas the faith alone people are defining faith differently within team faith. And that's not the kind of faith that saves, right?
That's right.
So Paul is dealing with two different teams. James is dealing with two different squads on the same team. So
that's a good way to put it.
That's the way I think about it. So Paul here, if you're on team works of the law, you are not part of God's eschatological people. You have to be on team Jesus, which is the faith, right? Apart from that. And the reason why it's apart from that, it comes with the very next question. Is God the God of Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles also? Yes, of Gentiles also. He's trying to say, if it was just team works of Torah, then God is just the God of Jews only, which excludes Gentiles, and Gentiles would have to become Jewish in order to be God's eschatological people. But since God is a universal God, he's the God of the cosmos, which includes both Jews and Gentiles also, it can't be something that is distinctly Jewish that defines God's eschatological people.
Yeah, and I like how you put that. The two groups, the team faith and the team Torah, that kind of gave me, because I kind of need more on a visual way to conceive of stuff like this, because it's like I had it in my mind, but I see what you're saying whenever he's putting this out there about the Jews boasting in the law, and he's like, no, you're justified apart from the law, which we could always get into that discussion about should Jews continue to uphold the law, like all that stuff, but as long as, like, Christian Jews, but I had a point I was going to, and I sidebarred away from it. Sorry. I told you I didn't have a lot of sleep last night.
You are 10 or so years. How old are you?
34.
You're more than 10 years younger than me. You can't be having memory problems. I have memory problems, but I'm old.
I need to just start when you're talking and I have a point I want to make. I need to put it down, or else I'm going to forget it.
Well, it's all downhill over 30 anyway. So
good news.
That's how I understand. But yeah, so that's why that question of the that Paul asks is more of a rhetorical question. That is why I go back to the boasting comment and say, given that Paul is dealing with these kinds of themes here, the boasting seems to be the identitarian boasting, not necessarily the proto-Pelagian who's patting himself on the back for his good works in Torah, or the Arminians or provisionists who like to pat themselves on the back for their free will choices or whatever.
You went exactly where I was trying to go, but lost my train of thought.
Yeah,
that goes back to the boasting, everything you just said, because is he not the God of the Jews only? That was one of the reasons that whenever I looked at the boasting, I was like, yeah, that I just don't see works in general, modern day debates that we have over this stuff, post-Reformation. Like, I think the context is very clearly, like, he's talking specifically what I would say, like, Jews boasting in their election or their covenant or Torah, however you want to frame that.
Right. Well, I mean, it's like the thing, if you were to ask Paul, I think Paul would say, well, being a good person doesn't save you, right? I mean, of course not. Faith in Jesus is what saves you. And if you properly understand faith, right? Faith is a robust thing. It's an active thing. It's an alive thing. Even Luther made that case. So Paul would say what people want to say. That's just not the point of this passage, right?
Well, that makes me wonder, because now that I'm thinking about it, like, is there a context in the first century, like in the first century church, or those that they're trying to evangelize, where people are like, no, I'm going to merit my salvation through my good works? Like, is that even a thing that would have been something that needed to be addressed? Because I can absolutely see Jews and Torah, needing to be addressed. But what about just like a general, like, people going around saying like, no, I can merit this on my own? Like, is there any context for that in the
kind of? Well, let's take the Jews first. Okay, so D.A. Carson edited 2 volumes called Variegated Nomism, and it was to push back on some of the new perspective proponents who were saying that Second Temple Judaism was not this save yourself by your good works thing, and it was okay. It wasn't great. I mean, the one person who came out looking the best out of both volumes was Peter Enns, and they hate that guy now. So,
Yeah.
But I mean, yeah, I mean, there you can find sporadically in the Second Temple literature, because it's, I mean, talk about variegated. There was flickers of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So some Jews did think that, but even the ones that did, in general, they saw Judaism as a religion of grace, and they saw their works of Torah as a way to respond. Though it did get into, various forms of legalism where you had to be good enough and outweigh and all that, but not quite. I mean, that was there, and that might have been who Paul was rebutting, but that doesn't tell the whole story about all forms of Second Temple Judaism, right? Or all those who wrote in the Second Temple period Jewish literature. So, I mean, that's why I say that whole thing was a mixed bag. But I think it did enough to show the new perspective that you can't just screen all of that out with the Jews.
Right.
Because there
were
were
more complicated.
Yeah, there were some, but I don't think that they made the case that, well, we can go back to the old perspective now. Right.
Yeah.
It's just a little bit more complicated.
Well, and I asked that question because I'm looking at this, and in the context, it's like it's very clear that, to me anyway, I'm sure it's well debated elsewhere, but the works of the law, and this is like Jewish focused on them and their boasting towards that end. So I don't see this being a proof text for, I guess you say, people in general just trying to do good things to merit their salvation. I think the context of this is specifically more Jewish focused. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Now, as far as like a more broad, in a couple of the dialogues, Phaedo, maybe it was Euthyphro, maybe it was the Apology. Anyway, there's at least two, if not more, dialogues of Plato where there is a judgment according to works, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Plato seemed to think that when the gods weighed all that out, most people did not get to ascend, right?
Right.
So it ended bad. So there was a kind of sense of a more general thing, but the temperament, which just to go completely off topic, except for it's related to Paul. If you notice, Paul never talked about hell anywhere. Never mentioned hell, right? In any of his letters, nowhere in Acts does he ever talk about hell. Because whatever your view of hell, annihilation, eternal conscious torment, whatever, if you were to tell the average Greek or even just Greco-Roman citizen that, well, you need to do this or you're going to have a miserable afterlife, they would have said, yeah, we know. We're going to have that anyway.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, they just all assumed that it was going to be miserable in Hades anyway, right? Yeah. There was not a lot of hope because the expectation was very few people had a decent afterlife for those who believed in the eternal soul or whatever. So, yeah, but I mean, nobody ever thought that they would be good anyway, right? Or good enough for the gods to ascend them. So, yeah, I mean, their whole thing was a negative outlook. So what did Paul focus on? He focused on, well, this one God is the God of the entire universe, which relegates all other gods to just mere created things that y'all dreamed up or demons dreamed up or something. It's just they're irrelevant. Whether there's whatever you make of their ontology, we know that they're nothing, says Paul, nothing in the world. Right, that's
Acts 17.
Well, in first, when he's talking about food sacrificed to idols,
that's right.
Yeah. No, people in Acts chapter 17 always talk about their favorite thing is Paul quoted pagan philosophers.
Mm.
That's not my favorite.
Yeah.
That's not my favorite thing. My favorite thing is Paul took the altar to the unknown God, said this is the most revealed God in existence, and all the other gods don't really exist, or at least not the way you think. Right? Turning that on its head, I think, is the coolest part of that.
That's what I had in mind when you said that.
Yeah. And the fact that he divided the crowd from the philosophers, and he pitted the Stoics and the Epicureans against each other, if you know their different philosophies. And he flipped the idea, the Stoics' idea of pantheism on its head, by quoting the pagan poet, because it's not in us. He has his lives, moves, brings. We, live, move, and have our being in him. Right? It's the other way around.
Yeah,
because they were just kind of pantheist types. So he pits the crowd of very religious Athenians against the philosophers, and then he pits the philosophers against each other. It's a brilliant speech that he does there.
Oh, yeah.
But what does he appeal to there? There's an example. He never talked about hell. He talked about judgment, right? Judge against Christ, because the creator God has been offended by everyone.
Yeah.
But he's going to judge everyone. So you're in the shame column to this God. So he appealed to the honor shame dynamic, having shamed their creator. He didn't really embellish the judgment talk, right? You're going to be judged. Well, they already thought they were going to be judged by some pantheon or other, right? So, or at least the Epicureans didn't, but probably the Stoics didn't either. But the men of Athens,
right? Yeah,
they would have thought that. So judgment and shame is what he talked about more than like eternal conscious torment or even annihilation or whatever your view of hell is. That wasn't his thing, right? And that's kind of what he appeals to through Romans, is that honor shame dynamic. And he's saying, if you want to be the eschatological people of God, the God who is the God of both the Jews and Gentiles, then you have to attain to the righteousness that comes by faith. You have to be on team Jesus, not team works of Torah or team faith, right? So that's kind of what he's getting at here. Did you have something to add to that?
Nope. I think you covered everything I had jotted down, or we did.
Love is a battlefield, and knives and poison are the weapons of choice. Jews boasting in their election or their Torah isn't the same thing. I don't know if that means election or their Torah. The only reason they have Torah, I don't know if that's just putting those two against each other, because the reason why they have Torah is because of their election. So
yeah, I think that might have been because I think something I said might have seemed like I was like equating them or making them synonymous. I wasn't doing that.
Oh, okay.
All right. I didn't mean to. That's how it was said.
So just to finish up on works, where do you fall on that old perspective on Paul versus new perspective on Paul?
Well, I mean, I do.
He didn't even put anything about the apocalyptic perspective on Paul.
Yeah.
I noticed that. I was like, wait a minute.
I think, I mean, if I were to be honest with where I'm at now, I just can't get behind the people who want to disregard the new perspective on Paul entirely. Like I could never do that. And I might even say that I'm going to lean more in that direction, which I know comes with the accusation of works salvation. But like I said, to me, there's a big difference between works in context of how Paul might say it, how other people talk about works in theological debates, and meriting salvation. I just think there's a lot there that muddies up the debates. But I think I haven't had as much exposure to either perspective that you have had, but I have had enough to say that I like the new perspective on Paul, even if some conceptions of it are overly simplistic or too broad in their application, if you know what I mean.
Well, I think actually the other way around. I think the old perspective is too broad on what they specifically mean by works.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Works of law. I think you can find people on both sides that will say, well, Paul, the good exegetes in the Reformed crowd, or even the old perspective that are not Reformed but just Protestant, they understand works of the law means he's speaking to Jews who try to be justified by that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the new perspective, some of them want to limit that more to just the identity markers, and I don't go that far. That's too narrow for me.
Right.
So I'm kind of in that group that's on both sides that say, well, this is really just talking about the Mosaic law, and it's primarily speaking to Jews, because he's trying to stress that point that God is the God of both. And if not that Romans is rehashing the Galatians controversy with the Judaizers, but the same point is being made that if God was the God of Jews only, then all the Gentiles would have to, then the Judaizers were right? They have to become Jewish in order to be Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's trying to say that it can't be defined by works of Torah. And you had brought up earlier, what would Paul's thing about Jews who continued to follow Torah? Well, I think that's adiaphora, like Paul wouldn't care as long as they didn't attach anything in terms of privilege or piety to it.
Yeah.
Like I'm extra saved,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if it's your custom, do it, right? Because Paul, well, if he's around Jews, he becomes like the Jews. And in fact, even though it ended in a riot in the book of Acts, he told Paul to settle the Jews down by doing more Jewish stuff at the temple, right? You need to go do these animal sacrifices and all that, settle people down, because they think that you're out running around saying that, oh, this is all dumb and we're not doing this anymore. So, I mean, and then, the same Paul who said, if you are circumcised, you're obligated to follow the whole law. And then he told Timothy to get circumcised.
Mm-hmm.
So I think for Paul, just how do you sort through all that? I think Paul's thing is, I mean, this doesn't add anything to your standing before God whatsoever. But if you want to do it, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that matter of wisdom in the context that you're going to be practicing or not practicing it. Is it going to be a stumbling block or something like that? Yeah,
I mean, and of course, the destruction of the temple in 70 AD took care of a lot of it. Right?
Mm-hmm.
The whole temple cult's no longer in operation, so you can't really do all that.
Yeah, I've actually read some people who have said that while Gentiles don't have to uphold Torah, if you were a Jewish convert to Christianity, you were still expected to uphold Torah.
I don't think Paul would. I don't think Paul would affirm.
Oh, I've never been on that train for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like kind of more of a dispensational thing. Is that where you've heard it from that crowd?
If I did, I didn't realize that's what it was.
Yeah, it sounds like. I mean, I've heard dispensation. Of course, not all dispensationalists. Put out the disclaimer. Not all, but I mean, there are some dispensationalists who think that God has two tracks. One for the Jews.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I can see what you mean by that.
That's crazy. That's crazy talk. There's the 7 dispensations, the 5 dispensations, the mid-act dispensations.
They vary.
Yeah, a lot of different things. But there are the people that relegate everything Jesus said in his earthly ministry to not applicable, because he had that. And I'm like, that's crazy talk too.
There's like an Acts.
That's not all
dispensational. Yeah, there's a specific one that's like, at this point in Acts, this new dispensation was entered, and it's not Acts 2, I don't think. I think they actually push it back to like Acts 7 or 8, something like that.
Yeah.
Acts 7 after the martyr of Stephen.
Yeah.
Something like that. I think those are considered more hyper, but I could be wrong about that.
Yeah, I'm not into all of that. I used to be kind of in that dispensationalist crowd, kind of the light dispensationalism, the if you believe in 2 testaments, you believe you're dispensational, the John MacArthur type, that's where I came out of. and they could say what they want. They were reading Left Behind books in the 90s. But even if John MacArthur wasn't, dispensationalists sure were, people in that vein. I never finished the series. I just thought it was bad fiction. But
well, that's why I kind of avoided using the word with a previous. It might have been last week or the week before, where the passage we were started off with, but now.
Yeah.
And I was like, so this is speaking of this new dispensation where, and I was like, people might get hung up on that if I use that word. So we'll just say we're, after the atonement.
Well, in the book of Ephesians, we have the word translated into the dispensation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so people say dispensation's a Bible word. That means dispensationalism is true. It's like that doesn't work. It's not, I'm covenantal, right?
Mm-hmm.
And no, you don't have to be a Calvinist to be covenantal. But I take more of the covenantal approach. But you can't say that because our English translations use the word dispensation, dispensationalism is true. Because no Bible uses the word Trinity. Does that make it false? Because the word Trinity is not in the Bible? That's not how you do theology. So please don't do theology that way.
It's like, you're probably embarrassing some people who actually know what they're talking about and are scholars on that side whenever you say something like that.
In a hypothetical Steve Gregg versus Dr. Michael Brown debate, I'm going to be on the side of Brown.
And what's that context? Is that eschatological?
Yeah, I don't.
Well, Steve Gregg, he's an amillennialist, right?
Yeah.
And I think Michael Brown is pre-mill.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And that debate, I'm a mostly leaning all mill. I could be convinced. I mean, like historic premillennialism, I could be convinced of that, but nobody has yet. So I just kind of default to all millennialism.
Mm.
But as far as like dispensationalism goes, no, you could be a premillennialist without being a dispensationalist. So.
Yeah, and I think that with several of the views, there are plenty that it's like, well, I can knock that out right now, like dominion, theonomy, postmillennialism. I'm like, yeah, no, we're not doing that.
Yeah.
General postmill, like a Michael Jones, how he would parse it, that's one thing, but take over the world for Christ. I'm like, no, I'm not going there.
Well, not for Christ, but in the name of Christ, but not necessarily for him. It's for them. Yeah. Well, when we get to Romans 12 and 13, we can get Tim Stratton on here and rehash the Christian nationalism, But Tim Stratton's not a post-mill theonomist Christian nationalist, so maybe we'll get one of those guys with the last name Wolf.
we got to find someone.
Yeah, the authoritarians. We'll get somebody in here to argue with us on Romans 12 or 13. If we ever get there, it could be 100 years from now. At the rate we're going, this is our 13th episode, if you count the debate live stream where Leighton and Dr. White were debating. But it's taken us 12 episodes to get to the end of chapter 3. Sounds about right.
We'll probably get hung up in a few of those chapters that get pretty dense, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe not. I imagine, I always thought 9 through 11 would be pretty dense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I want to argue without getting into it with too many Calvinists either, because I mean, if one wants to show up, fine. But I don't. Here, I'm confused with my buttons here. I don't think people realize how much non-Calvinists can argue about Romans 9. And I think that would be good for people to see that there's a lot to argue about verse by verse through Romans 9 that has nothing to do with Calvin. Romans 8, 28 through 31 as well, right? You can get into foreknowledge debates, predestination debates. You can get into eternal security debates. A lot of stuff coming down the pike. So,
yeah, that'll be fun. That's one thing I said in a previous thing. I was like, I'm actually looking forward to Romans 8. That'll be fun. Yeah,
I hear you. They're all fun. We're gonna make Romans chapter 16, where Paul's saying hi to half of Rome. We're gonna make that fun.
There you go. We'll get into history, right?
Yeah. So he has the justified, who is the person justified by faith apart from works of the law? Gentile, Jew, universal person. Third option that affirms Christ's faith and human faith. So we had talked about the subjunctive versus, the subjective versus the objective in faithfulness of and faith in.
Mm,
Now, I think we maintain that a person, or really the man, is justified by faith apart from works of the law. That is the universal, in my opinion. Paul is saying, whether you are Jew or Greek, everyone is justified the same way. It's by faith and apart from works of the law. And that, so the person is not, it could be a Jew or a Gentile. It's not, it's more universal than that, because the whole thrust is the universality, because God is not the God of Jews only. So,
yeah, I was spending some time on that, but mainly because of specifically what he says right after it, or is God the God of Jews only? So that's what, I think I even said, like, yeah, the universal is just really easy to see there, but I'm like, they gave me some pause though.
Does he mean, does he mean we maintain that? I mean, it could be polemical if that person, but was Jewish, because we maintain that a Jewish man is justified by faith apart, but he could be stressing the pandering to the Gentile audience. We maintain that a Gentile is justified by faith, but that goes, so that would be polemical, but that to me goes against the whole leveling of the playing field that we, the overall thrust since chapter 1.
Right.
So I think that he left. He has no problem using Jew and Gentile, or Jew and Greek, or barbarian, or whatever. He has no problem using an ethnic or a national identity when he wants to. The fact that he doesn't use it here, I think it's to stress the universality of it, right? That regardless of who you are, you were justified by faith. Now, it's in the singular, so we had talked last week, is justification corporate or individual, and Nick and I both think that it's yes, both. But which means the fact that he's using the singular here is representative.
Yeah.
So we've kind of talked about this in previous episodes, that in a collectivist culture, that is representative. It's not necessarily speaking about an individual. And I know people often will say, yeah, but a corporate body is made up of individuals, but that doesn't give you the currency that you think you have when you retort that, because the issue there is which one is primary.
Exactly.
And sometimes people try to use that phrase to say that the individual is primary, and that doesn't work for collectivist cultures in the ancient Mediterranean world or the modern collectivist cultures either. So
yeah, in cases like that, I think you're almost always going to get a collective being primary over individual, because it's just it was part of their mindset. But that retort is true. It's like a corporate body is still made up of individuals, and it's like, yeah, and they're going to cover those individuals by discussing the corporate body of which they are part of.
Right. And how do they identify themselves? Typically with the corporate head, right? And you've got Jesus as a, corporate head. And so their self-understanding is how they're in relationship with their corporate head. So that's how that works. In case people were curious.
To answer your question real quick, I did land on the universal. It's just whenever I had pause, I was like, I could see somebody saying that's a Gentile, but it's I'm kind of with you on that. That Paul, if that's what Paul intended, he probably would have been more clear about that. He would have had no problem.
Yeah, just
mentioning Gentiles or Greeks or whatever.
Yeah, so I think he's making the universal point. We already addressed, if you think it's one or the other, that takes this more of a polemical twist. But I think it's already polemical if you're on Team Torah, right? And so to say it's universal is itself polemical enough, right?
Yeah.
So we have that saying, the gospel is offensive on its own, no need to add to it. And that's kind of what's going on here, because if you're on Team Torah, you're not, and I think Michael Bird, who is actually the chairperson of Nick's dissertation, he's done some work on the, Second Temple Judaism's proselytizing efforts, and he seems to think that it was rather robust, right? So if that's the case, and then you have evidence, even Jesus dressing down the Pharisees, saying you'll cross land and sea for one convert, for one proselyte, though you'll make them twice the son of hell as you are. But you see God-fearers everywhere, so they seem to be rather active with this. And if they're actively proselytizing, they think that you have to become Jewish, right? Whether or not this Jesus business is involved or not. So it's polemical enough in this text to say the neutral, just the person, right? Jew or Gentile. That's polemical enough, in my view, because that's going to stick it to Judaizers back, Antioch or Galatia or wherever they show up, and it's stick it to Team Works of Torah. So that's kind of where I land on that.
I'm wondering if this most recent comment was directed towards you.
Oh boy, another justification before. No, that was addressed to this comment from earlier. James,
Gotcha.
Justification before men, not God, which I don't take that at all.
You thought that was like the easy cop out. I'm trying to remember. I saw your
really. I actually think I think they're all cop outs to try to reconcile things with neither to something that neither James nor Paul says that Luther thinks they said, because people read Romans through Luther's existential crisis instead of on ancient first century Mediterranean Second Temple terms. But in those discussions, I would say that the justification before men is probably better than the same vocabulary, different dictionary track. But I don't think either one of them work. It's funny. Paul specifically means something by apart from works of the law. And, a lot of people make hay that Luther added the word alone here. That's what Paul means in context, that it's faith. However, how you understand faith could be a separate conversation. I don't get upset with Luther adding that if by that you mean a proper understanding of faith that, like the one James had to correct, the dead faith of demons. If that's your understanding of faith, then no, you will be. James has no problem saying justified by works. He says it 3 different times. You're justified by works, not by faith alone. Protestants have a problem saying that, without qualifying it to death.
Right.
James, the brother of Jesus, had no problem saying it. I don't know why you're justified by works, not by faith alone. I have no problem saying it. What does that mean? I don't care. I can just say it, just like I can say John 3:16, for God so loved the world.
Yeah, it's just what he says.
Right. Wasn't Abraham justified by works? Wasn't Rahab justified by works? Justified by works? Justified by works? Who cares? James has no problem saying it, so I don't either.
Yeah, that's a more complicated relationship with whenever we discuss works and faith, and is often given the treatment or even the time of day.
Yeah.
In modern times, modern Protestant evangelicalism, because I do think that I mean, you can clear up some stuff in scripture, I think. Let me know if you disagree with this, but whenever it talks about, sometimes it like Jesus or elsewhere, it'll frame it as those who do good will be saved. And it's like, oh, okay, so are you saying it's works? And it's like, well, no, because the author is assuming if they are doing good, if they are obeying God and being faithful or obedient, they have the faith that comes with that. And if they're faithful, they have the obedience, something like that.
Well, the reason why James could just blurt it out, without feeling weird like post-Reformation, because I think the Catholics are all wrong on this too.
Yeah.
But the reason why James can say it is because he's talking against, if you have the dead, workless faith of demons, and that's your understanding of faith in Jesus, then it makes sense to say justified by works, not by faith alone, if you're operating on that definition of faith, right? If you're operating on what Paul and James both would understand faith, a robust faith from which works flow in gratitude out of loyalty to your patron, they would agree on that too. There's no problem here because, right? Because again, James is squad faith alone, bad definition of faith versus squad faith and works, right? Because works work together with faith. That's another thing that James says in James chapter 2.
I always wondered if it came down to the Frank Turek, like there's a difference between belief that and belief in.
Yeah.
And I say that specifically because in James 2, he talks about even the demons believe.
Right. So that's a deficient understanding of faith. So if that's your definition of faith, if I'm talking to somebody who has a dead, workless faith of demons and their idea is intellectual, I believe God is one. Yeah. And go on. And you're just willing to let your brother starve,
Right. So
if that's your understanding of faith, then it makes sense to tell that person, well, if that's your understanding of faith, if you're on squad faith alone under that bad definition of faith, then it makes sense to tell that person you're justified by works and not by faith alone, because faith has works. Works together with works.
That's why I like the term believing loyalty.
Yeah. Works perfect faith. Yeah. And works demonstrate your faith, right? The proper definition of faith. Whereas Paul is talking about team faith versus team works of Torah. So, this
goes back to what you were saying earlier.
Two teams. Yeah. James, one team with two squads. Bad definition of faith squad and the right definition.
Like it's the same school football team, but you got the varsity versus the JV.
Yeah. Shirts and skins. How we used to do it when I was young. Yeah, that's what's going on there. So yeah, justified. Paul's making a completely different point in a completely different context, right?
Yeah, and you're right.
Yeah,
they narrow it too much, and that's why you get things like you can't even believe, because then it would be considered a work. You can't believe on your own, or else it's considered a work. And I'm like, we're so far outside what Paul was trying to say here.
Right. Yeah. Paul is saying we've got Jews who think God is the God of Jews only, which means that if you want to be God's people, you have to become Jewish. And then you have the righteousness from God that's revealed in Jesus Christ and all of that. So yeah, Romans talks a lot about faith. But like I said, I don't have a problem with Luther inserting alone there if he meant what Paul meant. Like faith independent of Torah. Then it is alone. But if you just mean faith alone with nothing else, right? Well, that doesn't even survive here, because you're justified by grace. You're justified, as a gift by his grace. You're justified in Romans 5. You're justified by the blood, right? Let's see. You're justified by faith apart from works of the law. You're justified by the blood. You're justified by grace. You're justified by the resurrection because he was raised for our justification. You're justified by works and not by faith alone, right? So that's 5 things.
Yeah.
Alone means one thing, right? So if you're just using that as some blanket polemic, well, I mean, the Bible says you're justified by blood and by grace and by the resurrection and by works and by faith, not by works of the law, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you got to sort through all of that. But if that's what you mean, if you mean those 5 things by faith alone, then I'm with you. If you mean something else, then why aren't you saying you're just now? What they want to come back and say is, well, the only thing that you do is faith, but you don't even do that. It's which I'm fine. Well, I mean, Leighton Flowers goes through this a lot. What is the gift? And I'm happy saying faith is a gift, right? And what is it as a gift? It's not like a necktie where I hand you your faith in me, right? It's a this is how it works gift. You're saved by grace through faith and not from works. That it's that way instead of some other way. That's the gift, right?
That's how I've always thought of it. Yeah.
Right. But I have no problem saying, yeah, so faith is a gift. In what sense is it a gift? It's
right. It is a gift that we are saved, not on the basis of how good we do or what we merit, but on faith. Like that is a gift.
Yeah. Best Catholic commentary on Romans that you found profitable or helpful. Y'all need to have a list of necessary good commentaries. Yeah. Burn is okay, but I think the best one is Fitzmyer. Joseph Fitzmyer from the Anchor. Kind of expensive though, but it's he's a Roman Catholic and he wrote a commentary. And you'll find when you read Roman Catholics in their biblical scholarship, they say some things that'll surprise you. So, but I like Fitzmyer. He's a good one. What's your favorite commentary in general on Romans?
Who, me?
Yeah.
I've not read a commentary on Romans. not a dedicated commentary. I've read people dissect Romans, usually specifically Romans 9.
Oh, yeah. Well,
because I haven't taken your advice where you're like, hey, Derek, if you want to know this, grab a commentary, not this book that you're just like, oh, okay, it's pro this view, pro that view. Just grab a commentary, work through it in that. Like, I haven't done that, and I admit it.
Yeah, see, this is the thing. If you want to get the best information, you don't find it like if let's say you're in the soteriology debate, right? And you're going to see people in those, they're going to go through John 6, they're going to go through Ephesians 1, they're going to go through Romans 8 and 9, right? They're really not that good. If you want the best for like that, commentaries and journal articles, if you can access a journal database, those are going to be where you find the best stuff, right? Mm-hmm. That's why if you want to sort out, if you want to sort out those soteriology issues, go read either commentaries, monographs on those specific chapters. Like I know Abasciano wrote 3 separate monographs on Romans 9 alone that are really long. You can get the first version of it, which was his original dissertation at Aberdeen. You can get that for free online, I think.
And they usually know where to get it at a good price.
Yeah. And then what is it? TNT Clark that puts out his 3 volumes. Did he ever finish that?
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't either. I know that he had 2 out for a while. I don't know if he ever released the 3rd or not. I haven't kept up with it because I don't really get into a whole lot of Pauline stuff. But yeah, that's where you go. Commentaries. Keener's is a good one. I like Ben. I disagree with Ben Witherington in various places in his commentary. The Hermeneia, that's Jewett's commentary. That's really good. Disagree with him I disagree with all of them in certain places. Fitzmyer is good. Vic Riesener's Romans commentary from a Wesleyan Arminian perspective. If you could find that, that's fantastic. I like that commentary on Romans.
I'm gonna write that down. And just participating with the Biblical Rogues Gallery, going through Romans, and having read a bunch of those books you told me I shouldn't read because I'm wasting my time. I'm like, you know what? I'm starting to see it.
Yeah.
Like I read The Doctrines of Grace by this person, and it's just like, I don't remember what they said. It was novice, like lay level, just rhetoric on, with proof text. It's you don't get much out of it.
No, you're not going to get.
All I get is the bragging rights of that's one more book in this stack I have over here where I can say, look, I read all this.
Yeah.
What's that worth?
Best layperson watered down Romans 9 background if off topic. I want to. Harold F. Hunter, father to Braxton Hunter, has a Romans commentary for lay people. And it's not reformed, and it's good.
He's Southern Baptist, right?
He's a very good. It's Southern Baptist, but not Calvinistic. Braxton is a really good writer, and he got that from his father because his father is an outstanding writer. Of course, his father was an English major in his undergrad, so that's why he's. But the best book Braxton ever wrote was Letters to Ignorantia.
Phenomenal book.
Yeah, and he'll never write a better one than that. And I like it because it's the shortest. Just kidding. No, I'm not kidding. It's Brian Abastiano is Big Guns Detailed. Yeah. All right, so let's wrap this up. It goes a lot quicker when there's not 25 people arguing about this. And because we kept you an extra hour last week, we're going to end hopefully an hour sooner. But Derek, if you're preaching or teaching this passage, we got to get through the one more thing before we go.
There was one thing I wanted to bring up. Hopefully, it's the same thing.
Well, I'll let you know.
Well, whenever I get these passages, I go through them myself before I read the slides. And one thing that stuck out to me, let's see if I can pull it up. Verse 30, since indeed God who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith is one. The by faith and the through faith stuck out to me. And in the Greek, it's by faith, the ek pistis, and then I'm probably butchering that, and then dia pistis for the uncircumcised. So,
yeah, no, you got that right. It's ek.
That's what you want to talk about?
No, but I want you to talk about it.
Well,
it's not. I think it's on the PowerPoint here.
It is. That's why I thought it was interesting whenever it was on the slide. I was like, oh, okay, good. So it's not just me who that stuck out to, because I was going to ask about it.
Yeah, I forgot to get to 31. But I want to talk about the law.
Oh, where we end off.
Yeah.
Chapter on.
But because that's part of my preaching points. I was like, wait a minute, if we start talking about that, we never talked about what I mean by that. The by faith and the uncircumcised through faith. Yeah, I don't know.
I didn't know what to do with it, and I'm like, if you came to me and you said you have to come up with something to make sense of this, just spitball something. What I came up with is I referenced to Romans 1:16 to the Jew first and also to the Greek. By faith, it's the faith that was given to the Jew first, and Gentiles are justified through that same faith. They're like grafted into it. That's my wild speculation, but other than that, I got nothing.
Well, Nick was saying that your Greek is better than Nick was talking about like instrumentality of faith, right? As an instrument by which the circumcised, and this goes back to who that person was too, right? Instrumentally, it's I like what you said about first to the Jew, to the Greek, but faith used instrumentally as this is the access, right? This is the tool, right? And if you look at it like that, you can see this as softening, right? The God will justify the circumcised by faith, right? And then the uncircumcised through faith. because that God is one. And so that's like saying that, like what you said, the first to the Jew and then to the Greek. So the circumcised have this, they were the first to receive this unveiling of the righteousness of God through Christ. And so instrumentally, they go out, and it's through that vehicle of faith.
It's a good way to put it.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's one way. There's a lot of different ways, I guess. But I was going to let Nick hash that one out because I read these Pauline scholars. I'm a Peter guy, right? And I'm like, these guys are everywhere. There's like, for every verse, there's like 7 different options. I don't know how these Paul people put up with it. But I like, but the on the contrary, we established the law. What do you think that means? Where are you on that?
The way I took that is, let me look at it. The law is a step. Where's the verse? There it is. Okay, so do we then nullify through faith? Far from it. On the contrary, we establish the law. And I think what I had for that is a possible anticipation of an interlocutor there. But if Jews and Gentiles alike are justified apart from the law, is the law therefore null? And Paul is saying, no, the law should not be completely dismissed. It's just not the means by which we'll be right before God. It's useful for moral instruction and details God's promises. And it was like this. What I came back with was the schoolmaster that testified to our sinfulness and established it. So it served its purpose in those respects. It's not something that should just be disregarded. Like, oh, well, we have faith, so just forget about the law. It's useless now. It's like, no. We're not saying that. The law served a purpose, though.
Yeah, but you have the law of, by what kind of law of works? No, but by a law of faith. So this could be some wordplay here.
Mm-hmm.
We don't nullify, but see, I go back to where is it? Verse 21, witnessed by the law and the prophets, apart from the law. So I think he's talking about the law of Moses. I think he's still talking about Torah both times.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The very law that's nullified is the one that he's saying, on the contrary, we establish it. And what I think he means, I think through faith, I think this is saying what we do by faith is for both Jew and Gentile. I go with both here. Faith for whom? For both. What he's saying is that which the Torah was aiming at, that Israel failed in its vocation, God succeeded in Christ. So it's through faith that establishes the very thing that Israel couldn't by works.
So are you looking at that Christologically, like Jesus fulfilled the law in that respect and through faith in him, or are you?
Yeah, well, not just that, not that Jesus fulfilled the law, but instrumentally, Jews and Gentiles both forming one eschatological people on team faith, right? That's what Torah was aiming at all along.
Right. Okay.
And so that's why it's established in this apocalyptic unveiling of Christ, and then those who follow after the faithfulness of Christ by having faith in him.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I take that. I don't know if Nick disagrees or not.
And that's
he's not here to argue with me, though. So
that's kind of what I was kind of coming up towards. Is we'd have to parse out what, like, the specifics of it, but what the Torah, what the law set out to do, it did accomplish.
Yeah. And the big question, how is the law relevant for Jews and Gentiles? That's where you get into like the ceremonial, ethical, moral, like the eternal law, is it symbolic or whatever? I want to say, I mean, I agree with the people who say ancient Near Eastern Israelites did not they did not have these distinctions. right? They saw it all as one thing. But just because they didn't have it doesn't mean we can't make categorical distinctions within the Torah, even if they didn't view it as you can parse these things out. That doesn't mean that you can't, that they couldn't have made categorical distinctions. Oh, this is, this has to do with uh, purity rituals and pollution. This has to do with case law. This has to, this has to do with temple practice. They could make those. They're not stupid. So even if they saw it as one unity type thing, I think that, and I agree with that. I don't think that we could say that they didn't know the differences. That we could pick up this general moral, certain types of case law pertaining to morality versus instructions for temple worship and purity rituals and things like that. The idea that they couldn't tell the difference is ridiculous to me. So I'm sympathetic, but I think that argument all misses the point, because what he's talking about here, establishing that law, how is that law relevant? Well, number one, it's fulfilled and established. It's fulfilled in Christ and established by Christ saving people through faith, right? That's the God of both Jews and Gentiles. We establish that aim as God's new covenant eschatological people that was promised and witnessed long ago that there was going to be a new covenant, right? So there's that. I think the things that we can pick out that are temple cult stuff, that's not relevant to us, but that doesn't mean that we can throw all the moral precepts in the trash can, because I don't think Paul did, right? Because a lot of the New Testament imperatives find their moral roots in the Mosaic law. That's the background to it. And there's a book I had to read in my master's degree program long time ago called 5 Views of Law and Gospel, right? And there's the people that want to argue for these types of distinctions within the law, people who argue against it, people who want to take the theonomy approach. There's people that want to take the idea that if it's not repeated in the New Testament, then it's not relevant if it's in the Old Testament. And that doesn't really work, because you think God no longer has rules against bestiality just because it's not. I mean, come on. I think those are dumb ways of hashing it out. But one thing that I did like about the book is that it got me to really start paying attention to how is the law relevant to us, and Paul's spirit versus letter threads that you have both here and in the Corinthian correspondence that I think we need to pay more attention to, because in a sense, that's how we're establishing the law anyway, by, the fulfillment of the revelation of God in Christ Jesus, righteousness by him, constituting a new people, Jew and Gentile alike, what Torah was always aiming at, but the letter kills, but the spirit gives life, all that. We follow in a new way the spirit and not the letter, right? So all of that, this goes back to the discussion we had in chapter 2. I don't know if you were there for that several hundred weeks ago, whatever it was, where we had talked about verse 14 of chapter 2, with Gentiles who do not have the law instinctively perform the requirements of the law, though not having a law. How did they do this, right? And a lot of people thought that verse, a lot of commentators would think that verse pertained to, I don't rehash that whole debate, but thought that verse pertained to like some sort of moral law written on, whereas a lot of interpreters now see that as Gentile believers having the law written on their hearts, and that echoing Jeremiah and all of that. Chapter 2. And so we kind of mostly agreed on that. There were some naysayers, but
I was with you on that.
Right. And so that's, if you take that in chapter 2 and then you see this in chapter 3, granted, we have the hindsight of being able to read Romans backwards and forwards all we want to, right? But seeing that opened up to see why I think that's what Paul means here by we don't nullify the law, we establish what we establish the law, and then you carry that forward to Paul's distinctions of the Spirit versus the letter.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I understand and sympathetic to the idea that, well, you can't. I mean, Jews in the ancient Near East were chopping it up into these various categories, and then Paul wasn't taking some and not others into. I'm sympathetic, but I don't buy it, because I mean, an ancient Jew knew what had to do with the temple, what was just basic morality, what was case law, what, you know. So, and then in the Spirit, I think the Spirit, not the letter, lets me know that I don't need it repeated in the New Testament that human beings shouldn't have sex with animals. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't need that. That's why that argument that if it's not, you know, I mean, I'm glad we don't have the same case law. I mean, I don't want to stone adulterers, but
yeah, no,
I
think that's where the virtue ethics comes in.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, that's my take on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and that'll come out.
One.
Yeah, that'll come out more as we go forward, and Paul starts bringing up these distinctions about the Spirit and the letter, because that's before we came on. Nick actually popped his head in here and was in. He was talking about, you know, a systematic theology was the holiness book.
Yep.
Because that's one of the things that, I mean, he's a Wesleyan tradition, of course, but holiness is, you know,
a biblical, historical, and systematic theology.
Yeah, holiness is a thing that either gets talked about from piety, people trying to score piety points, or they're shy from holiness because of the very type of thing that comes up in verse 28 here about, well, I mean, works, those are good works, and we're not trying to be saved by works. And so everything that you think is about living holy, people try to say, well, you're just trying to do works-based salvation, and you're a legalist, because if you tell people to live holy, they're going to call you a legalist. And so that whole thing between sanctimonious piety, or what I call pseudo piety, versus, you know, antinomianism, you know, for Christians, and then everyone with the contemporary heresy hunter, they're going to say you're either a sanctimonious windbag for talking about holiness, or you're a heretic trying to save yourself and trying to add to the work of Jesus by trying to do better, you know, in your sanctification. And it just, there's so many things that get derailed by bad readings of this text.
Yep.
So yeah, I'll let you give your thoughts if you had to teach this, and then I'll wrap it up.
Well, unlike something like last week that had several different points that you could hit on and expand on, this one seems relatively straightforward. So I just keep it simple, you know, start off with the where is the boasting, just talk about the context of that, and get into the law of faith versus the law of works. I haven't really added. I'm like, oh, I would just say this verse, but I'm just point by point, just basically what each verse is saying. And then I really like since indeed justified, circumcised. But oh yeah, so verse 31 is where I would basically, verses 27 through 30 build up, you know, talk about Jews, the law versus the law of faith, and then bring that together to talk about do we then nullify the law through faith? Far from it. On the contrary, we establish it. Because my thoughts, whenever we, on that last slide that you had shown, how is the law relevant for Gentiles and Jews today? I was going to talk about the different ways that I see it being symbolic, apocalyptic, and Jesus Christ fulfilling it, and kind of learning God's heart about, you know, obedience. Because that's why I mentioned virtue ethics just a second ago. Like there is wisdom in understanding the ceremonial laws and all the other laws that came with it, just to kind of get a general overview of God's heart for establishing wisdom and moral and ethic on moral and ethical grounds. And then just, yeah, you said it, you framed it, or you phrased it a lot better whenever you talked about the establishing of the law, but basically how the law accomplished exactly what it was meant to. Yeah.
So I would do all of that. And when it comes to boasting, I feel like I would want to clean up, what boasting means here. There you can get to stressing don't boast in your individual merits or whatever, but I mean that's not the point. So I want to stress the point here that the reason why you can't boast is because if you were to boast, that would make God less universal in his scope of salvation and redemption. Because what I would stress is this boasting as, identitarian boasting. And this will come back up in Romans 11, about not getting arrogant because the branches were broken off so you could be grafted in. You don't be conceited, but rather fear, right? God is a universal saving God. That's not universalism, but salvation is for all peoples. And sometimes if we get too identitarian, we can cut off as the means by which God uses through the proclamation of the gospel, people from coming to faith, right? And so I would stress the universal scope of God's saving work in Christ. I would also talk about how apart from works of the law, I would say that doesn't mean that there's no law involved, because Paul has said that this is a law of faith. And then, of course, we have to keep reading to see what Paul means by that and what Paul means by establishing the law. But, the Spirit's law, life in Christ, has set us free from the law of sin and death, right? Paul loves to play around with this idea of law. So we don't need to be afraid of the word law any more or less than Paul is. And we can play with it too. And same thing with, justified by faith apart from works of the law. I would stress that this is aimed at God wanting to save everyone. And that's what he means by this apart from works of the law. I would not stress, guess what? You can't save yourself by your own good works, because lost people will say, well, I'm not trying to, so who cares? Right? I want to avoid all that. What I want to say is God is the God of everyone. And the salvation is for everyone who believes in Jesus, right? That's what I want to stress. It's apart from works of Torah to universalize the saving scope of God in Christ Jesus. So that's where I would say, and I say that by and through our faith in Christ, Christians established what the whole Old Testament was trying to aim at, what the whole Torah was aiming at, what was attested to by the Torah and the prophets. All of that was summed up in Jesus, so that God's redemptive scope can be worldwide and all-inclusive. So that's how I would preach this text and stress. I would stress the things that Paul's stressing. The whole line in Romans 3:28 about justified by faith apart from works of the law is a statement declaring the universal scope of salvation, because God is not just the God of one type of people, but he's the God over all people. And that's what that statement is saying. It's not a polemic against the proto-Pelagian that's trying to earn his way into some heaven by, because most people aren't trying to do that. Maybe in the 90s that had some play. But I think it was Austin Fisher who pointed that out, actually, to be... I think that's where I heard it first.
Was it in his book?
No. Carlos. Hey. I'm thinking
the right guy, right? He was a Calvinist, and then
he wrote a book against Calvinism, but that's not. I think I heard him say that in the talk, and it stuck with me ever since. Where he was like, he was making that joke about people aren't really trying to save themselves, So how does that? I mean, the only person in the Bible that told anyone to save themselves was Peter. So save yourselves from this corrupt generation. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. Peter the Pelagian. All right, folks. I think that does it for us tonight. It's not something you can boast about when it's something everyone can do. Amen. That's a Leighton Flowersism. He says that a lot. Folks, I appreciate you turning in tonight to just hear the two of us. Of course, because we're here the best and we were your only option. I don't know where all of our cohorts are, except for where Nick is. And I think I got some text messages from Braxton and Will, and I haven't heard from MJ.
I really thought Braxton was going to pop in.
I really did too, but I got a text while you were talking. It was like, I can't make it. I got something, but I don't know what I don't think it was important. I mean, nothing's more important than Biblical Rogues Gallery.
Like, we got to learn to teach them to prioritize.
I'm saying this is must see. I mean, when I was growing up, and this is going to age me, and no one still watching this cares, but like Thursday night was the night to watch network television, specifically NBC. Like that was when the best lineup from Central Time, 7 to 9. All the, I mean, back then it was like Cheers and stuff, but you know, Seinfeld, like all the cool. But nobody watches TV anymore, so
no, everybody watches YouTube.
Yeah, this is must-see TV on Thursday nights. If for no other reason than the renowned Dr. Beeler. Anyway, folks, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time on Trinity Radio.